Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that's, well, it's not something you hear about every day. We're talking about autism and trichotillomania.
Yeah, it's definitely a connection that often gets overlooked, but it's really important.
We found some research from Cheap ABA, and it turns out that this link is a lot more common than I think any of us would have guessed.
Right.
So before we get too far into it, can you give us a quick explanation? Like, for someone who's never heard of trichotillomania, what is it exactly?
Basically, trichotillomania is when a person feels this really strong urge to pull out their hair. I mean, it can be a really powerful urge, really overwhelming, and it's not just head hair either.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it could be eyebrows, eyelashes, really anywhere. And it can be, well, it can be a really tough thing to deal with, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not just like twirling your hair when you're bored. This is something different.
It's a compulsion.
And what we're seeing is that this is something that's a lot more common in people with autism, right?
Right. So in the general population, trichotillomania affects maybe 1 or 2% of people. But studies are showing that for people with autism, it could be anywhere from 6 to 15%.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty significant difference. What's the connection there? Is there something about autism itself that could make someone more likely to have trichotillomania?
Well, that's a really complicated question. There's not really a simple answer, unfortunately.
Right.
But there is some interesting research suggesting that there might be some shared mechanisms going on in the brain.
Oh, okay.
For example, both conditions seem to involve differences in brain circuitry,
Mhm.
especially the circuitry related to things like impulse control and being able to regulate emotions.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's almost like similar parts of the brain are involved in both conditions.
Yeah, you could think about it that way.
So how does that actually play out? I mean, how would that actually look like in someone's everyday life?
Okay, so think about it this way. Someone with autism, a lot of times they're dealing with sensory sensitivities, right?
Right.
And that often means they're just not able to filter out certain things that other people, they might not even notice these things.
So it's almost like they're experiencing those senses at a much higher volume than everyone else.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like everything's turned up way too loud. And for some people that can be, well, it can be completely overwhelming.
I bet.
Just imagine, like you can't tune out the feeling of, I don't know, like a clothing tag on your skin. Or maybe it's the sound of like a fluorescent light buzzing, and it just keeps building and building and building.
Well, that sounds awful.
It can be really, really uncomfortable. And so for some people, pulling their hair, it's almost like it offers a little bit of relief. It's not a healthy way to cope with it, obviously.
Right, of course.
But it's like in that moment, it distracts them from all those intense sensations.
So they're trying to self-regulate, even though they're using a method that's not, that's not good for them in the long run.
Exactly. And this is why it's so important to understand what's actually going on with that individual.
Right, because it might not be what it seems on the surface.
Right. What looks like, a behavior problem, it could be a sign of something much, much deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. It really highlights how important it is to look beyond the surface and try to understand the why behind these behaviors.
100%. And it also shows just how important early intervention is.
Right.
The sooner we can recognize these connections and get people the support they need, the better.
Absolutely. And speaking of connections, I do want to get into some of the statistics that this cheap ABA research highlighted, because I was actually pretty surprised by some of the numbers. Like, did you know that something like 1 in 36 kids in the U.S. are diagnosed with autism?
Yeah, it's a pretty significant number.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It really shows just how prevalent autism is and how important it is for everyone to understand it better, not just in society, but in healthcare, in education, everywhere.
I agree.
And within that group, within that 1 in 36, the overlap with trichotillomania is pretty big too. Like, the article mentioned that something like 30% of people who have trichotillomania might also be on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
That connection is a lot stronger than I would have thought.
Yeah, and that's a statistic that really makes you think about misdiagnoses and just how important awareness is.
Right.
Because someone could be getting treatment for trichotillomania, but nobody's realizing that autism could be like a major factor contributing to it, and vice versa too.
So they're getting treatment for one thing, but not the underlying thing that might be like feeding into it.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for everyone to have a really good understanding of both conditions and how they how they work together, how they might interact with each other.
Right, because then you can start to develop treatments and support that's actually going to make a difference.
Exactly.
Another point that the article brought up is that for a lot of people, trichotillomania usually shows up in late childhood or early adolescence.
Hmm.
What is it about that stage of life that seems to, like, bring it on?
Well, that's a time that's already so full of change for anyone.
Right.
Think about it. New social situations, school gets more demanding, hormones are all over the place. It's a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
And for teenagers with autism, it can be especially challenging. They might already be struggling with, sensory overload or having a hard time with social cues and
Yeah.
communication.
Right. Yeah.
So when you add all that extra pressure on top of it, it can easily become overwhelming.
It's like a perfect storm for stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
And we know those are big triggers for trichotillomania.
It's
And on top of all that, the article also mentioned something about, like, gender differences.
Mhm.
Apparently, trichotillomania is more common in girls and women in general, but it's especially noticeable in the autism community. Do we know why that is?
That's a great question. And to be honest, it's something that researchers are still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
One theory is that it might be because of how autism tends to show up differently in girls and women.
Oh, interesting.
Like they might be better at kind of camouflaging their symptoms or what they call masking,
Right.
trying to fit in, trying to hide their autistic traits, and that can put a lot of pressure on them.
Yeah, because then they're under all this pressure to be a certain way, to meet these social expectations.
Mhm.
And that can lead to even more stress and anxiety.
Exactly. So you've got that increased stress, and then you add in the hormonal changes that are happening during adolescence. And, well, it's not surprising that we see higher rates of trichotillomania in girls and women with autism. But, it's really important to remember that this doesn't mean that boys and men with autism aren't struggling too.
Right. It's just that they might not be getting diagnosed as often,
Exactly.
which again goes back to the importance of awareness and understanding that autism can look really different in different people.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the prevalence, the possible triggers, the gender differences, but what does it all really mean? What can people actually do with this information?
That's the million-dollar question, right? How do we take all this awareness and turn it into action?
Right.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is that we have to recognize trichotillomania, especially when we're talking about autism.
Okay.
We can't just brush it off as, a bad habit or something.
Yeah.
It could be a sign that there are some deeper needs that aren't being met. And those needs are important.
So then how do we actually address those needs? The article mentioned a few different interventions, but where do you even start?
Well, there are a few different approaches, and it often takes, a little trial and error to find the right combination for each person.
Right, of course.
One approach that seems to be really helpful for a lot of people is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
CBT, okay.
Yeah, and basically what CBT does is it helps people to identify and then change the negative thought patterns and behaviors that are contributing to the hair pulling.
So it's like you're trying to rewire those automatic responses to stress or anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. And one specific CBT technique that's been really effective is something called habit reversal training.
Habit reversal training, okay.
And that involves, first of all, just becoming more aware of those hair-pulling urges when they happen. And then, and this is the important part, learning to replace that behavior, that hair-pulling, with something else, something healthier.
So like if they feel the urge to pull their hair, maybe they squeeze a stress ball instead. Or like take some deep breaths.
Exactly, yeah. Those are great examples. And CBT also teaches people how to manage stress and anxiety in general, which can be so beneficial, especially for people with autism who might already be dealing with sensory overload or social challenges.
It's like you're giving them a whole toolbox full of different strategies to use when things get tough.
Exactly.
But it sounds like it's not just about individual therapy either, right? Like the environment probably makes a big difference too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Creating a supportive environment is crucial.
Okay.
And that can mean a lot of different things. Like at home, it could be about having really open communication.
Yeah.
Or in the classroom or at work, it might look like incorporating sensory-friendly practices.
Right, right.
And honestly, just educating people, educating peers and family members about autism and trichotillomania, that can go a long way.
Yeah, because the more people understand, the less stigma there is.
Exactly.
And then it creates a space where people feel safe and supported.
100%. It's all about building that community of support where people feel seen and understood, not judged for something that they often can't even control.
So it's really about taking this kind of multifaceted approach if you want to really help, right?
Yeah.
It's about individual therapy, yeah, but it's also about making changes to the environment and educating the community.
Exactly, yeah. You got to look at the whole picture. You can't just focus on the behavior in isolation. And of course, what works for one person might not work for another.
So there's no like magic solution that works for everyone.
Nope, definitely not. And that's exactly why it's so important to catch this early. When
Yeah.
you identify it early, it gives people the time to really explore different options and figure out what works best for them. Maybe it's CBT, maybe it's medication, maybe it's something like sensory integration therapy, or maybe it's some combination of different things.
It's all about finding what works for that individual person.
100%. It's about giving them the power to manage their own well-being.
Absolutely. And that includes connecting with other people, right? Like finding support groups or online communities, or even just having one friend or family member who really gets it.
Yeah, for sure. Having that kind of support system, those connections, can make all the difference in the world.
Oh, definitely. I mean, just knowing that you're not alone, that other people understand what you're going through, that can be so powerful.
Totally. And for anyone out there who, maybe they haven't experienced trichotillomania firsthand, maybe they don't really understand autism, the best thing you can do is, well, just try to be understanding.
Yeah.
Educate yourself,
Right.
challenge your own biases. Be an ally to people who might be struggling in silence.
I love that. It all comes back to creating a more inclusive and supportive world for everyone.
Absolutely. When we create a world where everyone feels seen and accepted, everyone wins.
Well said. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the connection between autism and trichotillomania. We've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about why these two conditions often go together. We explored some of the possible causes, and we even got into some potential interventions. But of course, there's always more to learn.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's what makes this whole field so fascinating. There's always something new to discover. But even with so much more to learn, one thing's for sure. Awareness is key.
Right?
The more we know about autism, the more we know about trichotillomania, the better equipped we are to support not just ourselves, but also the people around us.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So if anything we talked about today resonated with you or maybe just, piqued your interest, don't let the conversation end here. There's so many incredible resources out there, organizations, online communities.
Yeah,
Heck, there are tons of other deep dives just like this one that you can check out.
that's right.
Just keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. That's how we made the difference.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for joining us today and to all of our listeners for tuning in to this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration. Until then, stay curious.